Well, welcome back to Investing in Nature. We're in the second part of this debate in parallel with the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos. We're going to look in more detail at the economic implications. And I'm joined by two leading economists. First, we have Sir Masood Ahmed. Welcome. You are president of the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. And I need to emphasize, sir, because you've just been knighted by King Charles. Welcome. And Eric Bergloff. Welcome, Eric. You are normally based in Beijing at the moment, chief economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. And you're involved as well in the Maryam Foundation. Just give us a short description of what the foundation is.
Well, the Maryam Foundation is very much what we were just seeing here. Look, it's about leadership. It's about trying to think of leadership that is inclusive, that is focusing on the issues, trying to create, basing it on science, basing it on real research, and we are trying to apply it to different issues. So here we are applying it to nature, trying to see how can we make progress and drive the issues, particularly, of course, in emerging and developing countries.
Thanks, Eric. Masood, you're an economist, a distinguished economist. You both are. What is your analysis of the kind of things we've been hearing and the kind of analysis you've got of the challenge that there is to switch from our reliance on nature, but our abuse of nature and costing it in to everything we do?
Nick, thank you very much. So let me just react very quickly to the conversation that we were all privileged to hear. And I would say, have we made faster progress in getting to Montreal on biodiversity than it took us to get to Paris on climate change? Yes. In that sense, it was remarkable that we've been able to set these targets, we've been able to set goals, we've been able to make pledges, 30 billion from rich countries by 2030, commitments of 200 billion of overall financing, so doubling. But second, if you think to Paris now, which is still a few years back, right? Have we since then made the kind of progress on implementation of the commitments that were made in Paris that should give us confidence that what's happened in Montreal will lead to the kind of transformative changes in reality? This is the Sherry Rahman point, and I agree with her. I think, no, it's pretty disappointing in terms of doing it. And the final point I would make is then, okay, if we look back and say, why didn't we make these commitments? Why didn't we translate the commitments into actual practical decisions? I just put two thoughts in for you to react to. First, I think because we continue to think that we could make progress without changing our systems. So the development finance institutions on whom we relied to deliver a lot more financing, they never bought into that new role in the same way. The private sector, whom we said, you've got to think differently, their boards didn't buy into the same changes at that pace. So we didn't really transform the thinking in those parts of the economy that weren't represented at COP, at that time in Paris. Because it was sort of climate people thinking about how to sort out the world, but really you had to get everybody to think about that. And the second thing I would say is a leadership issue. What do politicians respond to? What do they react to? They have lots of day-to-day pressures that they're trying to deal with. Are they getting pressure from their voters to deal with biodiversity or to deal with climate change adaptation? More pressure on mitigation, but not so much on adaptation. Adaptation is somebody else's problem.
Do you believe they have the competence and capacity to handle the enormity of what they're facing at the moment?
They being?
Politicians.
Oh, I think they can organize the competence and capacity. I'm not sure they have the incentive structures within which they operate aligned with delivering those outcomes. Because their voters, the ones that they have to rely on, aren't yet saying adaptation is something on which we're going to judge your performance. So they respond to what they think is the near term. And the big leadership is clearly about thinking beyond what your immediate voters or what your immediate constituency is asking you to do. You have to get people to think to the future. That's where the capacity issue comes in, Nick.
They may be faced with a change coming down the track with the public, particularly the next generation, and how anxious they're becoming. Eric, what's your analysis listening to the first half of the debate?
Yeah, no, I think there is leadership is both about setting the vision and about building that capacity to do the how that Mr. Rania was talking about. So you need to have this kind of mission. You know, you need to know where you're going. And that, I think, is true in advanced economies, it's true in emerging economies, it's true in developing countries. And then you need to think about what is the capacity that you have. What are the instruments that the state has? Because it has to start with the state. Because if you want to get the private sector involved, you need to be able to work with the private sector. You need to have the tools to make sure that the private sector works in the right way, that you have open competition, that you have good procurement and so on. All that needs to work. So building state capacity is, for me, the essence. And then, of course, you also need to make sure that you get, in the climate space, you get the renewables, you get the right technologies and so on. All that needs to be created and you get it in the emerging and developing economies, because we're not going to get these transfers, unfortunately, unless we have credible policies. And that, I think, is what Minister Rania is talking about when she's saying the how needs to be addressed.
As chief economist, you have to put forward data. You have to get data. Is it clear what the data is now? We know from the IPCC and many of the scientific reports in the last 2 or 3 years just how dramatic it's going to be, and it's already beginning to show itself, breaching tipping points and breaching tipping points, breaching new tipping points. What is your impression of the ability of leaders to handle not just the unthinkable nature of this, but thinking almost the imponderable, the impossibility of it happening?
So I don't think it is now any longer a data problem. I think in the sense of that we know, I think, the scale of the challenge, in the sense we know, certainly in the climate space, but I think also now we have very good data in the nature space. So that's not the issue. Probably there's a data issue in translating this into specific actions and so on. But also that, I think, is kind of secondary issue. It's really in how do you get this through and how do you deliver on those insights that you have. That, to me, is the fundamental problem.
Let me ask both of you, what kind of sums of money are we talking about? I mean, you can hear staggering figures in trillions. Is that money available? Could it be available if the political class want to make it available?
Short answer is yes. The money could be available if the political class globally recognized this is where we want to put our money. We have demonstrated repeatedly that when we need to do something, we feel the urgency to do something, we can mobilize large quantities of money, for good reasons generally. But I think the real problem is that there's a bit of a disconnect between one conversation that goes on, which is about very large numbers, trillions of dollars a year for dealing with climate, even more trillions of dollars a year for dealing with climate and the sustainable development goals at the same time. And a second conversation, which is generally in the tens of billions of dollars, of how to increase sums of money that you have to slightly larger sums of money. And personally, I feel the way to make progress is to start joining up those two conversations much more. And I have a very practical area where I do think we can make progress. We created the development finance institutions after the Second World War, the World Bank, regional development banks, the IMF. They did a terrific job in helping the world deal with a set of issues. We can go into a discussion about errors they might have made or not made, but by and large, I think they served us well, the world well. But the challenges that we now face are not country-by-country challenges, they're cross-country global challenges. How to deal with preventing the next pandemic, how to ensure that we can deal with climate change. These challenges require these institutions to reorient themselves because they have a terrific working model, how to mobilize money, borrow it from capital markets, lend it at attractive rates, but they're not doing it for the right things right now. And there I feel we can, in 2 years, make enough progress that would result in maybe low hundreds of billions of dollars, additional money flowing every year. That's not the trillions we need, but it's a lot better than what we've got today.
Eric, what's your impression given what you're monitoring?
So I'm personally a bit skeptical about putting together money like this. You know, these are very different forms of financing we need. You know, we have loans, we have equity, we have all kinds of different kinds of loans, and they come with all kinds of different skills, different capacities. It is about sums of money, but we also need to have the capacity to use this money in the right way. We need what was talked about, bankable projects that actually can work when they come on the ground. You know, there's a risk, and we have seen it in many cases where you have a lot of money and it gets wasted. I'm personally, for example, very worried about all these renewables now, because renewables, it's fantastic what's happened to renewables. It's available now at, very cheaply, but renewables is complicated. It needs to be plugged into an energy system that really works, and if you want to get the full effect out of renewables, you need to have consumers that can adjust how to use it. You need to have a regulation that makes it work well and so on. We need to really make sure that we build that capacity to use all this money that I think is going to become available.
Let's get a question from the audience, please.
I'm Mark Halley from Nature Finance. You mentioned, Nick, at the beginning that we're looking at $700 billion to repair nature, to restore it to health. But of that, 500 billion is in reforming existing flows of finance. So the 200 billion that we need to raise up from the 80 billion that we have now is already a large sum. But that leaves aside the elephant in the room, which is the current misexpenditure, misallocation of funding, and that's in the hands of governments. So you look at the climate area, we're spending roughly $630 billion a year addressing climate change. We're spending 25% more than that subsidizing fossil fuels with taxpayer money. And so, yes, we should set up new funds, we should set up new financial instruments, we should get development right. But shouldn't we be focusing much more on what is within the decision-making capacity of governments to get rid of those counter-incentives that will enable us to go forward on a much faster pace?
Dominique, do you want to add to this?
I do want to add to this and echo something that the minister from Pakistan mentioned around redesigning financial systems. Seems to me that we are not being real about the planetary boundaries that we're all living in and must live within, but also around what we're valuing, right? We're talking about nature, but also young people and future generations. I think we're effectively discounting the futures of young people and future generations. And so my question to sort of add on that is really sort of how do we make sure that we center intergenerational equity as part of these conversations?
Masood.
Okay, can I just, because I think the 2 points that you've both raised, to me get to really a very important issue, which is what do politicians respond to?
And your answer?
Why they respond to what they think is the pressure from their electorate. Because why is it that people provide these subsidized prices on petroleum products? Around the world right now, in many countries, you basically have cut back the taxes you had on petroleum products. In some cases, you're actually selling it below cost. And why is it that they're not reacting to the intergenerational point enough? And I think it's because every time they try to do it, remember Gilets jaunes not so long ago? Remember riots in a whole range of developing countries, protests every time you try to raise petroleum prices? Even though in many countries, 70% of the subsidies are actually going to the richest 20% of the people because they're the ones that have the big gas-guzzling cars, right? Still, they're the ones that can bring the protests out. So it becomes a political issue rather than a technical issue. We know what needs to be done on every front pretty much. What we don't yet figure out is how do you change the politics so that the politics gets aligned with what it is that science is telling us we need to do.
Just before coming here, I was actually with the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, launching real pressure to build on governments, particularly from CEOs. But he said, without massive mobilization of finance, our aims will not be resolved. How can this be done, Eric?
So maybe just before I answer that question, because I think that is the ultimate. But I think before we answer that question, we need to create credible structures that can deliver on all that money being paid in. And I think we are, unfortunately, not doing that today. We are asking for a lot of money without really delivering the structures that will actually provide those results that we are suggesting. But on that, how do we get that future generations represent? It is in the carbon price. It's so simple, really. That's what, the carbon price is the valuation of the future. And that is a political issue. And that's, it's a difficult issue in advanced economies, but it's even more difficult in emerging and developing countries. But we need to get it, because that's the way. We need to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. The next step is to get the carbon price, because the carbon price is important because it helps adjust demand and supply, both consumers and producers. But it's also very important because it drives innovation. It drives everywhere in the economy. People are going to have incentives to innovate, to find more efficient ways of using energy, using renewables and so on. That's why we need these kind of signals from about future generations.
Could you do it in 30 seconds, please? Because I'd like 30 seconds from each of you, then we'll have to wrap up.
Slight issue with my friend Eric, which is, I think it's absolutely right that you need to focus on improving the structures for using larger amounts of money better. But I also believe that there are plenty of existing structures around the world that can use significantly more amounts of money already. And so we don't want that to become a reason to slow down on raising the money. That's the only point I want to make.
Dangerous slowing down, Eric.
No, so I think we completely agree on that. We need to link this to reform of these institutions. And we are for the first time in my lifetime, at least in the time that I've been thinking and living with these institutions, the development institutions, I think we have a real chance of reforming them. And we should tie that also to, ultimately, to getting an increase in the resources for them.
Well, Eric Bergloff and Sir Masood Ahmed, thank you very much indeed for adding weight to the debate which we had in the first half. I was very struck again by what the Secretary-General said, literally a couple of hours before we met here opposite the Congress Centre. He said, we are in trouble. There's too much backtracking going on. I've read a lot of UN reports in my time. I haven't fully read this yet, but this is a very dramatic report which they've just brought out. The global sustainability agenda is off track, it says. We are sounding the alarm. In other words, picking up on what Masood has just said, it's about the speed of what has to be done. And that's where leadership comes in and what the Maryam Foundation is about, Eric. So thank you all for joining us here, and thanks for watching us here on this video. Bye-bye from me, Nick Gowing.